The morning sun cast an eerie orange glow through the dense jungle canopy as Marine Private First Class Johnny Rodriguez pressed his face against the muddy ground, listening to the distant rumble of aircraft engines. It was August 7th, 1942, and the first American offensive of World War II was about to begin on a remote island in the Solomon chain that most Americans had never heard of, Guadalcanal. The heat was already unbearable at dawn, and Rodriguez could feel sweat trickling down his spine as he adjusted his rifle. Around him, 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division crouched in their landing craft, approaching the beaches of what would soon become known as the Island of Death. The invasion had been planned in haste, driven by intelligence. Reports that the Japanese were constructing an airfield that could threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marine Division, had received only 5 weeks to prepare for this operation, codenamed Watchtower, though his men grimly referred to it as Operation Shoestring due to their inadequate supplies and equipment. As the landing craft churned through the choppy waters off Guadalcanal's northern coast, Vandegrift knew he was leading his men into the unknown against an enemy that had never tasted defeat. The Japanese had been caught completely off guard. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's forces were scattered across the Solomon Islands, and the construction workers building the airfield, mostly Korean laborers supervised by Japanese engineers, fled into the jungle at the first sight of American warships. What should have been a bloody amphibious assault became an almost unopened landing, with Marines splashing ashore on Red Beach to find abandoned equipment and half-eaten breakfast meals still warm. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goetge, the division intelligence officer, surveyed the captured airstrip with amazement. The Japanese had nearly completed what would become Henderson Field, named after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The runway was 75% complete, with fuel dumps, ammunition stores, and construction equipment scattered around the perimeter. It was a prize beyond their wildest expectations. But the easy landing was deceptive. As Marines pushed inland through the oppressive heat and tangled vegetation, they began to understand the true nature of their enemy, not just the Japanese forces regrouping in the jungle, but the island itself. Guadalcanal was a living nightmare of disease, mud, and death that would test every man's endurance to its breaking point. Context drawn from official U.S. Marine Corps historical records and John Shudang An. The jungle seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Vines thick as a man's arm hung like nooses from towering trees, while unseen creatures rustled through the undergrowth. The air was so humid it felt like breathing through wet cloth, and within hours, uniforms were soaked with perspiration and mud. Marines discovered that their maps were woefully inadequate. Vast areas marked as unsurveyed stretched across the island's interior. By nightfall on August 7th, the Marines had established a precarious beachhead, but intelligence reports warned that Japanese naval forces were steaming south from their base at Rabaul. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's transport fleet, already nervous about operating so close to enemy air bases, prepared for what many believed would be a swift evacuation. The stage was set for what would become 6 months of the most savage fighting in the Pacific Theater, where both sides would discover that Guadalcanal would give no quarter to either the living or the dead. The darkness of August 8th brought with it a terror that would haunt the waters around Guadalcanal for months to come. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer had raced down the Slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, under cover of night, intent on destroying the American landing force before it could establish itself. At named 3 minutes past 1 o'clock in the morning on August 9th, the Battle of Savo Island erupted in a maelstrom of searchlights, torpedo wakes, and naval gunfire. The Japanese attack was devastating in its precision and ferocity. Within 32 minutes, 4 Allied cruisers lay sinking or severely damaged, including the Australian heavy cruiser Canberra and the American cruisers Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. Captain Frederick Reefcoal of the Vincennes watched in horror as Japanese shells tore through his ship's superstructure, turning the bridge into an inferno. "We're being murdered!" shouted one of his officers as the cruiser listed heavily to port, her magazines exploding in towering columns of flame that could be seen from Henderson Field 12 miles away. The naval disaster sent shockwaves through the American command structure. Admiral Turner, fearing further Japanese attacks, ordered his transports to withdraw immediately, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal with only 4 days' worth of supplies and ammunition. As the ships disappeared over the horizon on August 9th, Major General Vandegrift realized his men were truly stranded in enemy territory. The Japanese High Command, emboldened by their naval victory, began planning what they believed would be a swift recapture of the airfield. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, dispatched Colonel Kiyono Ichiki and his elite regiment, veterans of campaigns in China and Manchuria, to eliminate what intelligence reports described as a small American force of perhaps 2,000 men. Ichiki's confidence was absolute. His men had never known defeat, and he planned to attack the American perimeter with the same banzai charges that had proven successful against Chinese forces. On the night of August 20th, 900 Japanese soldiers gathered on the east bank of the Ilu River, preparing for what their commander promised would be a glorious victory that would drive the Americans back into the sea. The Marines, waiting for them, had spent 2 weeks transforming Henderson Field into a fortress. Barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery positions created an interlocking field of fire that covered every approach to the airfield. Colonel Clifton Cates, commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, had positioned his men with the tactical wisdom earned through years of training, but nothing could have prepared them for the sight of hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging across the sandbar at the Ilu River's mouth, screaming, "Banzai!" and firing from the hip. The Battle of the Tanaru River, as it became known to the Americans, though it was actually fought at the Ilu, began at 1:30 in the morning with a frontal assault that seemed to come from another century. Japanese soldiers, many carrying only rifles and bayonets, rushed straight into the interlocking fire of Marine machine guns and artillery pieces that had been pre-sighted on the river crossing. Private Al Schmid, manning a machine gun position, fired continuously until his weapon barrel glowed red-hot in the darkness. Around him, Marines watched in stunned amazement as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers fell, only to be replaced by more charging figures emerging from the jungle. The carnage was unlike anything American forces had yet encountered in the Pacific. When dawn broke on August 21st, the beach was littered with nearly 800 Japanese corpses, including Colonel Ichiki himself, who had committed ritual suicide rather than face the shame of defeat. Only a handful of Japanese soldiers survived to retreat into the jungle, carrying with them news that would shock the Imperial General Staff. The Americans were not the weak, soft enemies they had been told to expect, but determined fighters, willing to defend their positions to the death. The roar of aircraft engines over Henderson Field on August 20th marked a turning point in the Guadalcanal campaign. 19 Grumman Wildcat fighters and 12 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers had arrived aboard the escort carrier Long Island, bringing with them the pilots who would become legends as the Cactus Air Force, named after Guadalcanal's code designation. Major John Smith, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 223, surveyed the primitive airstrip with a mixture of determination and concern. Henderson Field was barely operational, with a single runway made of pierced steel planking laid over coral and dirt. There were no hangars, no proper maintenance facilities, and fuel had to be pumped by hand from 55-gallon drums scattered around the perimeter. The pilots faced conditions that would have grounded air operations at any civilized airfield. The constant heat and humidity corroded aircraft systems, while frequent rain turned the runway into a muddy quagmire. Spare parts were virtually non-existent, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Captain Marion. Carl, one of the squadron's aces, later recalled that keeping even half their aircraft operational was a daily miracle performed by exhausted ground crews working with improvised tools. Despite these hardships, the arrival of American air power immediately changed the strategic balance around Guadalcanal. Japanese forces, accustomed to operating with complete air superiority, suddenly found their daylight movements under constant attack. Transport ships approaching the island faced swarms of dive bombers, while ground forces discovered that their supply columns were vulnerable to strafing runs by marine fighters. The Japanese response was swift and violent. Admiral Yamamoto's forces began what would become known as the Tokyo Express, high-speed nighttime runs by destroyers and cruisers that would bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements before withdrawing at dawn. These ships, dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Americans but called Nezumi Yuso, or rat runs, by the Japanese themselves, represented a new form of naval warfare adapted to the realities of air power. Historical context referenced from Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, The Struggle for Guadalcanal. On the night of August 24th, the first major Tokyo Express run delivered 1,500 men of the Ichiki Detachment's reinforcements, along with artillery and supplies. The Japanese destroyers shelled Henderson Field for 40 minutes, destroying fuel dumps and killing several Marines before disappearing into the darkness. At dawn, Cactus Air Force pilots found their runway cratered and several aircraft destroyed, but within hours, Marine engineers had the field operational again. Captain Joe Foss, flying his Wildcat on morning patrol, spotted a formation of Japanese bombers approaching from the northwest, the beginning of what would become a daily ritual. The air battles over Guadalcanal took on an almost gladiatorial quality, with small numbers of fighters engaging in deadly duels above the jungle canopy. Unlike the massive air battles over Europe, these were personal combats where pilots learned to recognize their opponent's aircraft and tactics. The psychological pressure on both sides was immense. American pilots faced the constant threat of being shot down over enemy territory, where capture meant almost certain death. Japanese air crews, operating at the extreme range of their aircraft, had no hope of rescue if forced down in the ocean. Both sides fought with the desperation of men who knew that losing meant more than military defeat. It meant extinction. By early September, the Cactus Air Force had established a routine that would continue for months. Dawn would bring Japanese bombing raids, answered by desperate scrambles of whatever fighters could get airborne. Midday brought reconnaissance flights and attacks on Japanese shipping. Dusk meant preparation for the night's Tokyo Express bombardment, followed by frantic repairs to keep the airfield operational for another day's fighting. The primitive conditions at Henderson Field became legendary throughout the Pacific. Pilots slept in tents pitched next to their aircraft, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Meals consisted of captured Japanese rice, supplemented with whatever supplies could be flown in. Disease was rampant, with malaria and dysentery claiming almost as many casualties as enemy action. Yet somehow, the Cactus Air Force continued to fly, their presence over Guadalcanal serving as both shield and sword for the Marines holding the perimeter below. The pre-dawn darkness of September 13th was shattered by the thunder of Japanese naval guns as battleships Congo and Haruna unleashed a bombardment that would become known as the Night of the Battleships. For 80 minutes, 14-inch shells crashed into Henderson Field with methodical precision, turning the airstrip into a moonscape of craters and twisted steel. Major General Kawaguchi Kiyotake crouched in the jungle 3 miles south of the Marine perimeter, listening to the barrage with grim satisfaction. His 6,500 men of the 35th Infantry Brigade had spent 5 days fighting their way through the trackless interior of Guadalcanal, guided only by captured maps and the distant sound of artillery. Now, as the naval bombardment Lifted, it was time to execute the complex night attack that would retake Henderson Field. The Japanese plan was ambitious in its scope and coordination. 3 separate columns would assault the Marine positions simultaneously. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main attack against what the Americans called Bloody Ridge. Colonel Oka would strike from the west, and Colonel Ichiki's replacement would launch a diversionary assault from the east. The timing had to be perfect. Success depended on overwhelming the defenders before they could coordinate their response. Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, had spent the previous week strengthening the defensive positions along the ridge south of Henderson Field. His 800 men occupied a series of hilltops connected by communication trenches, but the line was dangerously thin, and the Marines were exhausted from constant patrolling and the effects of tropical disease. The first Japanese probing attacks began at 9:30 in the evening, with small groups of soldiers testing the Marine positions along the ridge. Edson, a veteran of Nicaragua and China, recognized the tactics immediately. These were not the main assault, but feints designed to locate weak points in the American line. He moved between his positions, ensuring his men were ready for the storm that was coming. At midnight, the jungle exploded with sound as thousands of Japanese soldiers launched their coordinated assault. The main attack struck the center of Edson's line with overwhelming force as screaming soldiers charged up the slopes of Hill 123 in waves that seemed to have no end. Tracer bullets created deadly patterns in the darkness, while mortar shells crashed among the Marine positions with devastating effect. Private Joseph Champagne, manning a machine gun position near the ridge's crest, fired continuously into the mass of attacking Japanese soldiers until his weapon jammed. Around him, Marines fell back from position to position as the enemy infiltrated their lines. The sound was deafening. Rifle fire, grenades exploding, men screaming orders and dying prayers in 2 languages. The Japanese breakthrough came at 2 in the morning when Kawaguchi's men overran the forward Marine positions and began advancing toward Henderson Field itself. For a terrifying hour, it seemed as though the entire American position might collapse. Major Kenneth Bailey, leading a desperate counterattack, fell mortally wounded while attempting to plug a gap in the line, his last words reportedly being, "They won't get through here." Combat details referenced from official Marine Corps battle reports and veteran interviews compiled by the Historical Division. Colonel Edson rallied his men for a final stand along the ridge's military crest, a position that would forever after bear his name. In the pre-dawn darkness, Marines who had been driven from their forward positions reformed and began a methodical counterattack, supported by artillery fire from batteries positioned around Henderson Field. The Japanese, exhausted from their night-long assault and disorganized by their partial success, found themselves caught in the open as dawn broke. The Battle of Bloody Ridge lasted 3 days, but the night of September 13th-14th was its climax. When morning came, over 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the slopes, while Marine casualties numbered 143 killed and wounded. More importantly, Henderson Field remained in American hands, and Japanese morale, built on a mythology of invincibility, suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. Kawaguchi, his carefully planned offensive shattered against Marine determination, began the long retreat into Guadalcanal's interior. His surviving men would join the growing number of Japanese soldiers struggling to survive in the jungle, reduced to scavenging for food and fighting an increasingly desperate defensive campaign. The initiative in the Guadalcanal campaign had shifted permanently to the Americans, though months of savage fighting still lay ahead. The waters around Guadalcanal had earned a grim new name by October of 1942, Iron Bottom Sound, named for the dozens of warships from both sides that lay scattered across the ocean floor. The naval battles around the island had become a deadly chess match, with each side seeking to control the sea lanes that meant the difference between reinforcement and starvation. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, paced the bridge of the heavy cruiser. San Francisco, as his task force steamed through the darkness toward Cape Esperance on the night of October 11th. Intelligence reports indicated that another Tokyo Express run was approaching, and Scott was determined to break the pattern of Japanese naval victories that had plagued American forces since Savo Island. His 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers represented the most powerful American surface force yet committed to the Guadalcanal waters. The Japanese force approaching from the northwest was commanded by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, who was escorting 2 seaplane tenders loaded with supplies and reinforcements. Goto's 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers had made this run dozens of times, and their crews had developed a dangerous confidence in their night-fighting superiority. They expected another easy victory against what they assumed would be American transport ships fleeing at the first sign of combat. At 11:46 in the evening, radar aboard the destroyer Duncan detected the Japanese formation approaching at high speed. Scott, unlike previous American commanders, had drilled his ships extensively in night combat tactics and had positioned his force to cross the T of the approaching enemy, bringing his full broadside to bear while the Japanese could only reply with their forward guns. The Battle of Cape Esperance began at 11:47 when Scott ordered his ships to open fire. The heavy cruiser Helena's 6-inch guns erupted in sheets of flame, illuminating the night with their muzzle flashes and catching the Japanese completely by surprise. Goto, aboard the cruiser Aoba, was mortally wounded in the first salvo and died believing he was under fire from his own ships due to a communication error. For 24 minutes, the 2 forces exchanged devastating fire at point-blank range. The Japanese cruiser Furutaka, hit by multiple shells, began to list heavily and fell out of formation. The destroyer Fubuki exploded in a towering column of flame when an American shell detonated her torpedo tubes. But American ships suffered as well. The destroyer Duncan, out of position and silhouetted against the gun flashes, was hit by both Japanese and American fire and began to sink. Captain Moran of the cruiser Boise watched in horror as Japanese shells penetrated his ships' armor and exploded in the forward magazines. Only the quick action of his damage control parties, flooding the magazines with seawater, prevented the cruiser from sharing the fate of so many ships in these waters. The Boise limped away from the battle with her bow nearly blown off, but she remained afloat. The battle's outcome was tactically indecisive. Both sides suffered significant casualties and withdrew to lick their wounds. But strategically, Cape Esperance represented a crucial American victory. For the first time since the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign, an American surface force had stood and fought the Japanese Navy in a night action, proving that the enemy was not invincible in their preferred element. Naval engagement details drawn from Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive Pacific naval history. However, the Japanese continued their relentless pressure on Henderson Field. On October 13th, the battleships Kongo and Haruna returned for another devastating bombardment, this time joined by the heavy cruisers Chokai and Kinugasa. For 2 hours, these ships poured shells into the marine positions, destroying aircraft, fuel dumps, and ammunition stores while killing dozens of defenders. The psychological effect of these bombardments was almost as devastating as the physical damage. Marines crouched in their foxholes, listening to the screaming descent of 14-inch shells and knowing that each explosion might be their last. Sleep became impossible, and the constant tension began to take its toll on even the most experienced veterans. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 212, surveyed the wreckage of Henderson Field after the October bombardment with grim determination. Half his aircraft were destroyed or damaged, fuel was running critically low, and spare parts were non-existent. Yet somehow his pilots continued to fly, patching their planes with whatever materials they could find and stretching their fuel reserves to the absolute limit. The battle for control of the seas around Guadalcanal was entering its most critical phase. Both sides were pouring reinforcements into the campaign, But the Americans were beginning to gain an advantage through their superior industrial capacity and growing control of the air. The Japanese, stretched thin across the Pacific, and unable to replace their losses as quickly as the Americans, were fighting an increasingly desperate campaign to hold on to their early gains. The outcome would determine not just the fate of Guadalcanal, but the entire direction of the Pacific War. The night of November 13th, 1942, brought with it the most savage naval engagement in the history of warfare, a point-blank gun battle that would leave Iron Bottom Sound littered with the wrecks of 14 warships and forever change the course of the Pacific War. Admiral Daniel Callahan's force of 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers steamed directly into the path of Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment force, setting the stage for a battle that would be fought at ranges so close that some ships could not depress their guns low enough to hit their targets. Admiral Abe's mission was simple but crucial. His 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, were to bombard Henderson Field into oblivion, while his escort of 1 light cruiser and 11 destroyers swept away any American resistance. Intelligence reports had assured him that only a few American destroyers remained in the area, and his massive battleships carried special high-explosive shells designed to destroy the airfield and kill every Marine defender. What Abe encountered, instead, was the most determined American naval force yet committed to the Guadalcanal campaign. Callahan, flying his flag aboard the heavy cruiser San Francisco, had positioned his ships in a single-column formation, a decision that would prove both tactically questionable and strategically brilliant. His sailors were tired, his ships were worn down by months of combat, but his orders were explicit: stop the Japanese bombardment at all costs. At 1:58 in the morning on November 14th, the opposing forces stumbled into each other in the darkness between Savo Island and Cape Esperance. The engagement that followed defied every convention of naval warfare, as ships from both sides found themselves intermingled in a chaotic melee where friend and fire could barely be distinguished from foe. The destroyer Atlanta found herself caught between 2 Japanese battleships, her light armor no protection against 14-inch shells that tore through her hull like tissue paper. Admiral Callahan, realizing that his formation was dissolving into chaos, gave the order that would define the battle: odd ships fire to starboard, even ships fire to port. This simple command allowed American ships to engage targets without fear of hitting their own forces, but it also demonstrated how desperate the situation had become. The heavy cruiser San Francisco, her bridge lit by Japanese searchlights, became the focus of concentrated enemy fire. Admiral Callahan was killed instantly when a Japanese shell detonated on his bridge, along with most of his staff. Captain Cassin Young took command of the ship, even as shells continued to crash into her superstructure, determined to keep fighting until his ammunition was exhausted or his ship was sunk. Battle narrative compiled from survivor accounts collected by the Naval Historical Division. The Japanese battleship Hiei, designed to fight at ranges of 10 miles or more, found herself surrounded by American destroyers firing torpedoes at point-blank range. The destroyer Laffey, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hank, charged directly at the battleship's bow, her guns blazing away at the massive ship's superstructure. When a Japanese shell destroyed her forward gun mount, the surviving crew members continued to fire with rifles and pistols until the ship was blown in half by a direct hit from Hiei's main battery. The battle reached its climax when the destroyer Monson attempted to torpedo the battleship Kirishima, but was caught in the crossfire between multiple Japanese ships. Hit by over 30 shells in less than 5 minutes, the destroyer became a floating inferno, her magazines exploding in a fireball that illuminated the entire battlefield. Of her crew of 250 men, only 37 survived. By dawn, on November 14th, both forces had withdrawn, leaving Iron Bottom Sound filled with burning and sinking ships. The Japanese had lost the battleship Hiei and 2 destroyers, while suffering heavy damage to most of their remaining ships. The Americans had lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with most of their surviving ships heavily damaged. In terms of tonnage sunk, the Japanese had won a tactical victory, but strategically the Americans had achieved their objective. Admiral Abe, his force shattered and his flagship crippled, abandoned his bombardment mission and retreated toward Truk. Henderson Field remained operational, and the Cactus Air Force continued to fly. More importantly, the battle had demonstrated that American sailors, when properly led and motivated, could match the vaunted Japanese Navy in night combat. The cost had been enormous. Over 1,500 American sailors died in the 13-minute battle, including Admiral Callahan and numerous ship captains who had fought their vessels to the death. But their sacrifice had saved Guadalcanal and marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The rising sun was finally setting on the Empire's dreams of conquest, though neither side yet realized how decisive this night battle would prove to be. The final act of the Guadalcanal campaign began in the steaming jungles west of Henderson Field, where 17,000 Japanese soldiers under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake prepared for what Tokyo had designated as the decisive battle for the island. It was January 1943, and Emperor Hirohito himself had issued orders that Guadalcanal must be retaken regardless of cost. For the Americans, Major General Alexander Patch's reinforced 14th Corps represented the largest ground force yet assembled in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese position had become desperate beyond measure. Months of failed reinforcement runs and constant air attacks had reduced proud infantry regiments to starving bands of diseased men subsisting on grass, roots, and the occasional captured can of American rations. Colonel Tsuji Masanobu, visiting the front lines, was shocked to find soldiers so weak from malnutrition that they could barely carry their rifles, much less mount effective attacks against increasingly well-equipped American positions. General Patch, a methodical commander who had replaced the exhausted Marine units with fresh Army divisions, planned his offensive with the thorough preparation that American industrial might now made possible. His 25,000 men were supported by tanks, artillery, and constant air cover, luxuries that had been unthinkable during the desperate early days of the campaign. The contrast with Japanese capabilities could not have been more stark. The final Japanese offensive began on January 7th with attacks along the Matanikau River that demonstrated both the courage and futility of their position. Soldiers of the 2nd Division, many weighing less than 90 pounds due to starvation and disease, charged American positions with bayonets fixed, only to be cut down by concentrated machine gun fire. The few who reached the American lines were too weak to continue fighting and collapsed from exhaustion. Captain James Jones, commanding a company of the 164th Infantry Regiment, watched these attacks with a mixture of admiration and horror. "They kept coming," he later wrote, "even when it was obvious they had no chance of success. Some of them could barely walk, but they still had their weapons, and they were still trying to kill us. It was the most pitiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen." The American counteroffensive, launched on January 10th, moved forward with the inexorable power of a machine designed for victory. Sherman tanks, finally available in significant numbers, crushed Japanese defensive positions that had held up infantry attacks for months. Artillery barrages, coordinated by forward observers with radio communication, systematically destroyed enemy strongpoints that had seemed impregnable. Final campaign details, referenced from official Army historical records, maintained at the National Archives. By February 1st, organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal had effectively ended. General Hyakutake, his army reduced to fewer than 12,000 effective soldiers, received the most difficult order of his career: abandon Guadalcanal and evacuate all surviving troops to the island of Bougainville. Operation K, as the Japanese designated their withdrawal, would be the Imperial Navy's last major success in the Solomon Islands campaign. The evacuation, conducted over 3 nights between February 1st and 7th, demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had made the Japanese Navy feared throughout the Pacific. High-speed destroyer runs, carefully timed to avoid American air attacks, successfully removed over 10,000 soldiers from beaches near Cape Esperance. American forces, expecting another reinforcement attempt, were caught completely off guard when they discovered that the enemy had vanished into the night. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, leading a patrol into the abandoned Japanese positions, found scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Starving soldiers too weak to be evacuated had been left behind with grenades to commit suicide rather than face capture. Medical stations filled with dying men bore testimony to the horrific conditions Japanese forces had endured during their final months on the island. When the last Tokyo Express destroyer disappeared over the horizon on February 7th, the Guadalcanal campaign officially ended after exactly 6 months of combat. The Americans had won their first major ground victory against the Japanese Empire, but the cost had been enormous for both sides. Over 7,000 American servicemen had died, along with an estimated 25,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The strategic implications of the American victory extended far beyond the capture of a single island. Japanese naval aviation, the elite force that had dominated the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, had been bled white in the skies over Henderson Field. Irreplaceable veteran pilots, the products of years of intensive training, had been shot down faster than they could be replaced. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 2 years of unbroken victories, lay in ruins on the beaches of Guadalcanal. Most importantly, the Americans had learned how to fight and win against their most dangerous enemy. The lessons learned in the jungles and waters around Guadalcanal, combined arms tactics, night fighting techniques, and the crucial importance of air superiority would be applied with devastating effect in the island-hopping campaigns that followed. The rising sun was beginning its long descent toward defeat, though 3 more years of savage fighting remained before final victory would be achieved. Guadalcanal had indeed marked Japan's first major setback, but more than that, it had revealed the industrial and military potential of an aroused America. The green hell that had claimed so many lives on both sides had become the graveyard of Japanese hopes for victory in the Pacific War.